Well, this morning we're continuing our Theology for Dummies series. This series is tailored just for me because I'm pretty dumb. And so it's been fun learning a lot of good stuff and digging in and studying. But no, the big idea behind this series is we're trying to take the big theological words and concepts that get thrown around in church that a lot of people scratch their head and go, what in the world does that mean? And try to explain them in ways that hopefully make a little more sense to us. So hence the little phrase there, big words and profound concepts put into words the rest of us can understand. I hope I accomplished that goal this morning. That's not a small task. But that's been the goal. So hopefully, I hope you guys have been learning some stuff through this. This morning we're going to be looking specifically at the topic of depravity and grace. And so what I want to do this morning is take this passage from Ephesians chapter 2 that we just read, where Paul talks about this topic. And I want to break it down a bit. We're going to do a bit of an old-fashioned Bible study sort of thing. I want to look at specific words and phrases and just see if we can take this passage and understand a bit more of what Paul's really getting at. Because I don't know about you, but at first glance reading through that passage is like, man, there's a lot of big stuff in there and heavy stuff. And I'm not sure what it's saying to me. And so hopefully the goal is to kind of break this all down this morning. So we're going to start with our first word in our topic this morning, and that's the word depravity. How many of you know what depravity is all about? Good, no one. Okay, then we're tracking here. Depravity is a big word. So what I want to do is just let's spend a few minutes talking about what it means. Okay, the World English Dictionary. Here we go. Dictionary definition time. The World English Dictionary defines the word depravity as the state or an instance of moral corruption. Depravity is the state or an instance of moral corruption. Those are still kind of big words, aren't they? So let's break it down a little bit more. The key phrase in that definition of depravity is moral corruption, obviously. That's what depravity is talking about, right? That's what depravity is all about. It's about moral corruption, which we could translate into a word that we're a little more familiar with in the church, and it's actually the word that Paul really hits on in this passage, and that's the word sin, right? Sin also has to do with this idea of moral corruption. That's what sin's about, right? Okay, so let's go a step further. Let's talk about sin for a minute. The World English Dictionary defines sin as transgression of divine law. That's simple to understand, right? Good. Transgression of divine law, that's how it defines. So it's God's law. It's divine law. It's God's law. In other words, it's going against God's law. It's transgression. It's going the opposite direction. It's going against what God has set out. This is the way you're supposed to live your life. This is what you're supposed to do. And we go against that. That's what we would define as sin. It goes on to say, or any act that's regarded as such a transgression. Anything that we do that goes against God. Especially a willful or a deliberate violation of some religious or moral principle. So in plain language, in Theology for Dummies language, sin is disobedience to God. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. It's anything that God wants us to do that we simply choose not to do. Or on the flip side of that, it's anything that God says don't do that, and we choose to do it anyways. Who cares what God says? So there's kind of two sides to the coin there. There's certain things that God says you should do these things, and we say, I don't want to do those things. Okay? It's disobedience to God. Or there's certain things that God says don't do that. Whatever you do, don't do that. We say, but I want to do that. And we do it anyways. It's disobedience to God. Okay, that's what sin is talking about. So depravity has to do with sin. Everybody tracking with me so far? Depravity has to do with sin. Has to do with our disobedience to God. Now remember from our definition of depravity that depravity speaks of either a state of moral corruption or an instance of moral corruption, right? That was our English definition of the word depravity, a state or an instance of moral corruption or of sin or of disobedience to God. It's important to note that in terms of what we're talking about this morning, the theology of depravity and grace, the theology of depravity, we're not just speaking of depravity in terms of an instance of moral corruption where you choose to do something in disobedience to God. Okay, we all do that, right? We all make mistakes. We're all sinners. But rather we're talking about the state of moral corruption. Okay? The state or the being of moral corruption. Which brings us to the first important point for us to make note of and all that, which is that according to the theology of depravity, we are born into a state of depravity. Okay? We're born into a state of depravity. We are born sinful by nature. Paul speaks of this in our passage in verse 3. He says this, if you look at the passage again, verse 3, he says, all of us, everybody say all of us. All of us. Who does all of us include? It includes all of us. Good. Okay, good. We're all together on this. All of us used to live that way. Everyone used to live that way. Following the passionate desires and inclinations of what? Our sinful nature. Following the passionate desires and inclinations of our sinful nature. He goes on and says, by our very nature, we were subject to God's anger, just like everyone else. So he says all of us start out this way. It's part of our nature. It's part of who we are. If something is part of your nature, it's just part of who you are, right? It's part of the way you are. We're born with this innate ability to look out for ourselves, aren't we? Nobody has to teach me how to look out for me. Okay? I'm really good at that. And we're born with this innate ability to live for ourselves. From the time we're children, this is part of our nature. We want the things in life that seem best to us, don't we? And you guys have kids that it's like, man, they want the stuff that seems good to them, right? Even if it's not good to them. I want the best toys for myself, and I don't want to share them with any of my friends. I want to eat candy for every meal of the day because it tastes really good. I want to run through the parking lot all by myself because it's really freeing and really fun. As children, though, we don't realize that if we eat candy for every meal of every day, that we're going to end up being 400 pounds and miserable. We don't realize that when we're kids, do we? Candy tastes good. Why would you not want to eat candy every meal of every day? Like, why? If I have candy on my plate or I have Brussels sprouts on my plate, why in the world would I eat these? It doesn't make sense to me. Okay? This isn't good. You say, Mom, you say it's good for me, but this isn't good for me. No way. Tastes terrible. We don't realize that if we run through the parking lot not paying attention to anything but ourselves, there's a good chance we're going to get hit by a car. That's not going to be a good thing. Okay, but we don't realize that as children, do we? We're innately able to look out for ourselves. What's best for me? What do I want? And so as parents, what do? We discipline our children, don't we? We discipline our children and we teach them to be obedient to those that are older and wiser. But why, Mom? Because I said so. Not because we do this not because we want to be mean, but because ultimately we love them, right? It seems really mean to our kids. How many of you young people that are in the room have really mean parents that do mean stuff to you? Yeah. Everybody raise their hand. Good. Yeah. We taught these Element kids to be honest. Yeah, but it seems like, man, why do I have to do this stuff, right? It doesn't seem good, but ultimately as parents, and one day, I promise you, those of you that are junior high school kids, I promise you one day, and we've talked about this before at Element, I grill this with them a lot. One day you're going to wake up and you're going to scratch your head and go, oh, that's why my mom and dad made me do that. And it's all going to make sense. And I can tell you this, and your parents will tell you this too, but I can tell you this because I've been there myself. I used to have parents that were really mean too, and did really mean stuff. And I didn't understand why. But there was that moment where one day I went, wow, that's why. They really do love me and care for me. Okay, ultimately it's because we love them and we want them to be safe and healthy. We want them to experience the best of what this life has to offer. Now, of course, we're broken human beings, so there are moments where your mom and dad are just mean just because they're mean. Sometimes they have a bad day at work, and it's like, hey, they're going to take it out on you. But most of the time, we do these things if we're in our right frame of mind and our right heart because we love our children and we want the best for them. But those things don't come naturally to us as human beings, do they? Because we're born sinful by nature. Listen to what Psalm 51:5 says. Psalm 51:5 says, "For I was born a sinner. Yes, from the moment my mother conceived me." Okay? From the moment of conception, we are born by nature into sin. So all of us are born into a state of depravity. But let's talk for a minute about what that means for our lives, okay? Because it's one thing to say that, but what does that mean for us? Paul brings up a few things in the first part of this passage, and so what I want to do is look at those things. What does this mean for us? Okay, I know I'm born into a state of depravity. What does that mean? What does that look like? Let's look at what Paul says. Those who live their lives in a state of depravity, or a state of slavery to sin, as Paul describes it, that's the language he uses, slavery to sin, are, number one, spiritually dead. Spiritually dead, okay? I have to say I'm pretty proud of myself for actually making points in my sermon. I never write sermons with points in them. And everybody always complains because I just give you a big blank sheet of paper and nobody ever knows what to write down. So those of you that are in my life group better show up with notes tonight because I went through extra work to actually give you points to write down. Number one, those who live in a state of slavery to sin or live in a state of depravity are spiritually dead. In verse 1 of Ephesians chapter 2, Paul begins by saying, once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins. Oh, okay. Were they literally dead? I mean, is that what he's saying? Of course not, right? They weren't once like keeled on the floor and dead. That's not what he's talking about here. What he's speaking of is more of a spiritual death, a separation from God and His power. If true life is found in God, that's what Scripture describes, right? The fullness of life we experience it in God, in relationship with Him. This is what Scripture describes for us. If that's true, if true life is found in God, then separation from God would be spiritual death, right? Tracking with me? Matthew Henry, in his commentary on this passage, he writes this. He says, sin is the death of the soul. Sin is the death of the soul. I don't know if any of you have ever been in situations before where you're caught in patterns of sin in your life. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm the only one that has that happen, but I do. If you've ever had these situations where you're caught in patterns of sin in your life, and all the while, as much as you might enjoy those fleeting moments of satisfaction that sin can sometimes bring, because let's be honest, I mean, sin, although it's incredibly destructive, sometimes it can be fun to be bad, huh? To do something you're not supposed to do. Like, we all have a little bit of rebel inside of us, right? And sometimes it feels good for the moment, and then all of a sudden you have this, oh, what did I do, sort of moment, right? Anybody ever been there? Just me? Okay. Just nod your head and pretend like you've been there if you haven't. But I'm going to trust that you can identify with what I'm saying. So as much as we might enjoy those fleeting moments of satisfaction that sin can bring, there's this overwhelming feeling that you're dying inside. And I've been there before myself, and I can so identify with Matthew Henry's comment that sin is the death of the soul. Because it's like the more and more it happens in your life, it's like it just kills you inside. And you're going, God, it's like Paul said, man, I don't do the stuff that I should be doing, and I do the stuff that I shouldn't be doing. But yet I really want to serve God. And yet there's this wrestling inside, and it's like it just kills you and beats you up inside. So the first thing, those who live in a state of depravity are spiritually dead. The second thing, those who live their lives in a state of depravity are conforming to the ways of this world. Conforming to the ways of this world. If we go on in the passage, verse 2, Paul says this. He says, you used to live in sin just like what? Just like everyone else. Just like the rest of the world. In other words, you're living just like everybody else does. There's no redemptive quality to your life. You call yourself a Christian, and yet there's no evidence of that at all in your life. You live just like everybody else does. There's no evidence that God is doing something in you. In his letter to the Romans, Paul, actually the same guy that wrote Ephesians, has this advice to offer to the people that he writes to. He says this. He says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world. Another translation says specifically, do not conform. You're probably more used to that translation. Do not conform to the pattern of this world.